I'm Reiner Benowitz, and this is part 8 of Machine Learning Essentials for Biomedical Data Science. In this video, we'll cover post-analysis in a machine learning analysis pipeline. Here's a quick reminder of the parts making up this video series. In the last 3 videos, we covered a small variety of specific machine learning algorithms, including tree-based algorithms, neural networks, and rule-based machine learning. We returned to our overview schematic, laying out the elements of a data science pipeline that uses machine learning. Previously in this video series, we covered defining the problem, collecting data, the elements of data preparation, and the elements of machine learning modeling. Again, in this video, we will focus on the following elements of post-analysis. In other words, what steps remain after we've trained and evaluated our models. Specifically, we'll discuss summary statistics, evaluating statistical significance, visualizing results, model interpretation and explanation, and replication. These elements are critical to drawing conclusions, communicating findings, and uncovering new knowledge about a target problem. Let's start with generating summary statistics for machine learning analysis. For each of the machine learning algorithms applied, we'll want to take the average and/or median of each of our testing data evaluation metrics over all cross-validation partitions. As we learned in video 3b of this series, taking the average across cross-validation partitions helps us to evaluate model performance with less opportunity to fall victim to sample bias. This is also a good time to calculate the standard deviation and/or other measures of variability for each respective metric. Additionally, we can take the average and/or medians for model feature importance scores over all cross-validation partitions, and similarly calculate standard deviation or other measures of variability for these as well. If you use strategies for estimating feature importance scores for the models trained with different algorithms, you'll want to normalize these scores before comparing them or combining them across algorithms. And another metric that might be useful to collect, especially if you're interested in comparing machine learning algorithm performance, is the average training time of each across cross-validation partitions. Next, let's briefly talk about the next post-analysis element, evaluating statistical significance. In an analysis pipeline like this, we're interested in whether performance differences differ beyond what we'd expect by random chance. So what differences might we want to evaluate for significance? We might be interested in whether any algorithms work significantly better or worse than others. We might also be interested in whether one dataset with some different subset of features, or from data taken from a different site, yielded better or worse performance than another. We will also want to ask what types of comparisons we want to be making. First, we might want to know if any of the methods or datasets, numbering 3 or more, perform different from the rest. And furthermore, we might want to make pairwise comparisons between each. We need to understand the comparisons we want to make first in order to make sure that we're picking appropriate statistical tests. And in picking tests, one of the first things we'll want to consider is whether to apply parametric or non-parametric statistics. Parametric tests rely on assumptions about the distribution of the population from which the sample was taken. In comparing algorithms or datasets, this sample will be the metrics or feature importance scores across each cross-validation fold. Well-known examples of parametric statistical tests include ANOVA for comparing 3 or more groups, and the t-test for pairwise comparisons. Non-parametric tests have the benefit of not relying on such assumptions, but are regarded as being less sensitive when the assumptions of a parametric test would have held. Examples of non-parametric statistics include Kruskal-Wallis by ranks for comparing 3 or more groups, and the Wilcoxon sign rank test for pairwise comparisons. Moving on to our next post-analysis element, we have visualization. As you may already be aware, there are tons of useful ways to visualize data, as well as the results of machine learning analyses. Some of the key things we may wish to consider visualizing include the training progress of certain algorithms over time, in other words, over learning iterations, or likely we'll want to visualize evaluation metric statistics between algorithms across all cross-validation analyses. And towards model interpretation, we may want to plot feature importances for individual algorithms, or create composite plots that summarize combined feature important estimates across all algorithms that have been applied. It might also be useful to visualize how a given model makes predictions, for example, visualizing the decision boundary of a classification model. And for a few algorithms that produce more interpretable models, we can directly visualize the models themselves. Let's take a look at a couple specific visualization examples. Here we have an example of visualizing average feature importance estimates from feature selection algorithms prior to modeling. On the left and right bar plots, we have the results from two separate filter-based feature importance estimation approaches. Also in each, we've ranked our features based on descending feature importance, so that we can easily identify what features are most likely to be informative prior to modeling. A visualization like this could be used, for example, to illustrate how we went about choosing a feature selection cutoff for including a subset of features in modeling. Here, the left algorithm identified only 30 features as being potentially informative, but the algorithm on the right identified 37. Now let's look at an example of visualizing model decision boundaries. This is usually only practical when there are a very small number of features in the model. In this classification example, we only have two features being included in a neural network model, labeled here as x sub 1 and x sub 2. The visualization attempts to capture how input values are transformed as they are passed through the hidden layers of the network, ultimately leading to this decision boundary as the final model, where instances in the region shaded orange are predicted to be class orange, and those in the region shaded blue are predicted to be class blue. And lastly, let's look at a simple example of visualizing a model directly. Specifically here, we're visualizing a decision tree model. This is similar to one that we looked at in part 5 of this video series. However, this example is for classification rather than for regression. In addition to the information included in each node, they're also shaded as orange or blue to indicate the proportion of instances at that node that are being predicted as either class 0 or class 1. Other examples of algorithms that generate models that can be visualized directly include linear regression, logistic regression, genetic programming, and learning classifier systems, which we discussed in part 7 of this video series. As promised in part 4 of this video series, the next element of post-analysis we'll discuss in a bit more detail is interpretation, and how it differs from explanation. First, as it is likely already clear, model interpretation or explanation is often facilitated by various visualizations. However, as we've previously alluded, there's an important distinction between interpretable and explainable machine learning. Recall that we defined model interpretability as the situation where a human can readily understand the reasoning behind predictions or decisions made by a model. In other words, it's the opposite of a black box. We had previously discussed what a black box is, what makes a model interpretable, and what are some different modes of interpreting or explaining models. Again, while few algorithms can produce truly interpretable models, most any can be explainable, at least to some degree. So now let's talk a bit about explaining machine learning models. The overall goal here is that once we train a model, in particular a black box model that we may have no other way of understanding, we would like a way to explain what factors drive that model's predictions, either on training or testing data. Down here, this figure is meant to illustrate that interpretability is king, but explainability can be one part of the overall model's interpretation. And further, within explainability, we have the concept of local and global explainability. Global explainability is in line with estimating feature importances of all features in a model, where we want to determine the extent to which each feature contributes to how the model makes its prediction over all of the data, which can either be training or testing data. On the other hand, local explainability is focused on addressing why a model made a particular decision on a single instance that the model was not trained on. So, given a black box model, or really any model, we can try to explain individual predictions using a handful of currently available approaches. Let's look at a couple basic examples. First, we could create another local model to estimate how individual predictions are being made by the model. One popular method is called LIME. Here's the paper if you're interested in learning more about it. Essentially, LIME takes a model and the instance prediction we are trying to explain, and it generates a new dataset by perturbing each feature individually. From this new dataset, LIME trains a new simple interpretable model, for example a linear model, which is weighted by the proximity of the sampled instance to the instance of interest. So in this illustration, this bright red plus sign is our instance of interest, And we can see the simple linear model trained by Lime, which was most influenced by these other nearby instances, represented as larger red plus signs or blue circles. Other instances in the permuted dataset generated by Lime that are farther away have less influence on this linear model. Lime is related to another approach to model explanation that involves Shapley values. Differently, if our model is involved with classifying images, there are also explanation approaches that can be used to locally estimate the parts of the image that were most important to classifying an image as one outcome or another. In this example, the parts of the picture involving this dog's face were identified as most important to correctly classifying this image as being a photo of a dog. While this can be helpful and interesting, explainability approaches like this have distinct limits on what they can tell us about how the model as a whole is making decisions in different contexts. So let's take a closer look at why relying on explainable machine learning rather than interpretable machine learning might not always be the best approach. Here's a paper by Dr. Cynthia Rudin, where she makes the case for using truly interpretable machine learning models rather than more complex black box models, in particular when dealing with high-stakes decision-making. First off, she notes that trusting a black box model means that you trust the data it's trained from. In practice, we know that most data is noisy and potentially biased, meaning that the model we train may also be problematic when put to use. Thus, when trusting the predictions of a black box, we're assuming the risk of any underlying problems with the original training data. And we have limited avenues for detecting or identifying those issues. We'll talk more about this over the next couple of slides. Next, she points out that when relying on explainability approaches, you fall into what she calls double trouble, where now instead of just relying on one model, we have to rely on two. And as we know from George Box's quote in part 4 of this video series, all models are wrong, each relying on their own unique assumptions, meaning that these two models that we now have will necessarily disagree with each other, at least in certain situations. If they always agreed, you could simply throw out the more complex black box model and keep the simpler explanation model to make all of your predictions. So in some ways, when relying on explanation systems, we might sometimes be fooling ourselves into thinking we understand the original model. Ultimately, Dr. Rudin argues that if you can produce an interpretable model that has comparable performance to a black box one, why go about explaining a black box model to begin with? Now let's look at some of the possible consequences of using black box models when we can't or haven't properly tried to explain their predictions. One of the key problems that has now come to light is failing to identify biased decision-making. Over the last few years, a number of new articles and research studies have come out identifying situations where a machine learning model was applied to make high-stakes decisions, such as determining parole eligibility or deciding what patients would benefit from certain programs, treatments, or other forms of care in health systems. In these examples, machine learning algorithms were capturing bias inherent in the data to make more accurate predictions on the training data. Using interpretable models or taking careful steps to explain model predictions can help to identify these types of biases before models are put into practice. This leads us to the topic of fairness in machine learning. The concept of fairness in a decision-making process uses two distinct notions for evaluation. The first is disparate treatment. Are decisions even partly based on any sensitive attributes of an individual? For example, race, sex, age, or sexual orientation. The second part of evaluating fairness is disparate impact. In other words, do model outcome decisions disproportionately hurt or benefit people with certain sensitive attribute values? Ultimately, in generating machine learning models that will be put into practice, it's important to identify disparate treatment and impact, and then correct our models, or the data we train our models with, in an effort to try and ensure fairness is achieved. If you're interested in learning more about these issues of bias and fairness in machine learning, there's a number of great books that have been written on this topic. Moving on, the last element of post-analysis we'll discuss is replication. Replication means that we can repeat an analysis and get the same or similar results. Replication is, of course, the gold standard of science in general. After all, it's harder to believe something that has only been observed once. Being able to replicate findings is a key starting point to demonstrating that an observation is real. In the context of machine learning modeling, being able to replicate analyses and findings is just as important. Papers like this one from 2021 have emerged, identifying shortcomings in the reproducibility of machine learning models trained for healthcare. There are many potential reasons for why some analyses might fail to replicate. Some of these reasons we can control, but others we may not be able to. These reasons might be logistical, like making sure the same code or same random seed was used to try and replicate findings. Or they could point to more complex issues that are difficult to control. So in trying to demonstrate that we can replicate our findings, we can ask if we get the same or similar results in the following contexts. The first might be to try to replicate implementing some machine learning pipeline and analysis if we didn't have the original code, but we have a description of the steps in a published paper. Or if we do have the original code, and we train the model again on the same data, do we get the exact same results when using the same random seed, where the random seed controls any pseudo-random choices made by the given pipeline? Or perhaps we want to see how similar the model is when we use the same code but change the random seed. And do we see dramatic variation in performance under these different conditions? Furthermore, if we use the original code to train a new model on some new data with the same or similar features, but include a different group of samples than those upon which the model was originally trained and evaluated, do we find that a similar model with similar performance is trained? And further, what if we take our trained models and see how well they make predictions on one or more new datasets? In practice, this could be some further holdout replication dataset beyond the test set partitions we've talked about so far for model evaluation. This new dataset might be collected at different locations, times, within different groups of individuals, or different health systems. For example, let's say we want to train a model predicting if a patient coming into an emergency room from a hospital might end up being sent to the intensive care unit. We may have trained the model on data from one hospital, but to evaluate if that model will be useful at other hospitals, we'll want to evaluate whether its performance replicates on data from a number of other hospitals that are representative of the hospitals we want to use the model at in the future. So what do we need to keep in mind when we're looking to apply our trained and evaluated models to new data? This new data might have been gathered to demonstrate that our model's performance can be replicated, or maybe we have deployed our model to make predictions in practice. For both of these things, we'll need to save some key information during training for downstream use. The first being the model itself. The second being the list of features, as well as their units if that's relevant, that are required by the model in order to make predictions. The third thing we'll need to save are any scaling transformations that were applied to the features in the data, so that any new data can be scaled in the same way. And fourth, if we had to impute missing data values in the original training data, we want to track how those imputations were done for each respective feature, so that when any missing values appear in new data, we could similarly impute them. If you're using Python to build your machine learning data science pipeline, then a package called Pickle can be a convenient way to serialize and deserialize any of the above items for lower space storage and easy reuse. This brings us to the end of our machine learning analysis pipeline, where ideally we also derive some useful knowledge from the process. This knowledge could take a number of forms. For one, perhaps we've developed an effective model that can be applied in the future to make predictions. Also, perhaps we've gained a better understanding of our target problem, including what features in the dataset were relevant versus irrelevant, as well as what values of the relevant features led to one outcome or another. These relevant features might also be candidate causal factors. In other words, they might potentially have directly caused the observed outcome, but further investigation would need to be conducted to determine if that's the case. Additionally, we might gain an understanding of the relationship between features and outcome by characterizing whether these associations were additive, interactions, or point to some heterogeneous instance subgroups. Furthermore, the results of our pipeline might generate new hypotheses for us to consider testing. The results might point us to some new future study design. They might indicate that we need to collect more data. We may want to follow up with more traditional statistical analyses for a deeper dive, asking more specific questions about the relationships in our data, or we may want to follow up on findings with new real-world experiments perhaps to see if an association in the data might be causal. Thanks for joining me for Part 8 of Machine Learning Essentials for Biomedical Data Science. In the next video, we'll take a step back to review as well as introduce some other machine learning pitfalls and solutions. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to follow my future content.